Last week, I began this series of sermons on God's purpose for us. And today I'm wondering if I should have titled the series God's Plan for Us. And that's because this is about purpose and plan. God's purpose, and then God's plan for us, and then our purpose for God. And we find all of this in the Bible. Now, by the way, in preparing these sermons, I have to plan. And I plan enough that you all have in your bulletin a half-page insert that you can follow along, the outline of this sermon. It has a fill-in-the-blank kind of thing. And that's not because I think you're all a bunch of elementary school children, but it's because it's a memory device. When the hand is working, it implants it into the brain, and you have a better chance of remembering it. You know, you all know that you forget about 95% of what you hear, and for guys, that's 105%. But if you write down a word or two, you might have a chance. And at the very minimum, you can walk away, even with an insert that doesn't have any blanks filled in, you can walk away, and somebody asks you, what was the sermon about? You can read the title, you know. There you go. So we find all of this, God's purpose, and then his plan, and then our purpose in the Bible. Remember, the Bible's not just one book. It's a collection of books written over a period of 1,400 years and 40 generations by 40 different authors from all walks of life. And yet it is thematically unified from beginning to end, revealing God's purpose and plan for us. So let's start with creation. Creation, good. In Genesis, which means, by the way, that word means the beginning. In Genesis, we read that God created a world teeming with abundant life, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So originally, God made all of creation good and to be good, including human beings. And God gave a special place to humans to be in personal relationship with him and to care for the rest of creation. This was God's purpose in creating us. Fall, bad. Get it? Creation good, fall bad. Something happened to that good creation. God created the man and the woman to have personal relationship with him and to care for the rest of creation. And he gave them perfect freedom with only one restriction. And that is that they not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in that day, God said, you shall surely die. That is, if you eat of this tree, you will define good and evil as you see fit, and it will kill you. Don't you think God knew something that humans don't? God's the creator. But wanting to be like gods themselves, they did eat of that fruit and still do so today. But because people were never designed to be independent from God's provision. Who designed people? God. They were never designed to be independent of God's provision. So the result was a fall from the original goodness of God. Robert Frost wrote about this in one of his most famous poems. Listen carefully to this poem. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. Did you catch the biblical allusions in there? So Eden sank to grief. The perfect goodness of the original creation in the Garden of Eden sank to grief. In just 5 words, Robert Frost described what happened to the human race when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. Sin entered. Death became our destiny. Sadness invaded the human DNA. Pain moved next door. And sometimes pain moves right into your own house, doesn't it? We were made for glory, but our glory faded long ago. First, we disobeyed. Then we died on the inside. Then we started dying on the outside. And then we turned to our own devices. And then we said, God, we don't need you at all. Leave us alone. And we wonder why the world is the way it is. Look in the mirror. Like Pogo, the famous cartoon from the way back, said, we have met the enemy and they is us. This story of creation, good, fall, bad, is the beginning point for understanding our life and times. But wait, there was another choice. Humans chose, and God then had a choice. Either abandon humanity and all creation to evil and self-destruction, that is, let it all go to hell, or institute a rescue plan, a plan of redemption. God chose redemption and began his plan to bring us back to the original goodness he intended. Stage 1 of God's rescue plan is the covenant with Israel. God chose one man and made him a promise that his extended family will be a prototype of what humanity can look like when restored to right relationship with God. And God initiated this covenant with Abraham for them to be in communion with one another. And Abraham's descendants are to model this restored relationship to the rest of humanity and all creation so that in time the whole world is drawn back to God. The man's name was Abraham, and his descendants the people of Israel. But Abraham and his descendants got sidetracked, drifted from God, and ended up in Egypt for 300 years as slaves. So God chose another man to bring the people of Israel back to God and to their true freedom. We might call it stage 1.1 of God's rescue plan. God chose another man. This would be Moses and the law. Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt and gave them the 10 suggestions, right? Just checking on you. Gave them the 10 commandments and groomed them for living with God as their leader and guided them into the promised land. The land where they were to be the model and the prototype for restored relationship with God. Now, since the effects of sin were still pervasive, stage 1.1 of God's rescue plan included provision for dealing with its effects. God gave Israel a range of laws to enable them to live together in relative peace. And because sin poisoned the relationship between people and God, he gave them a means for dealing with it. And that was the blood sacrifice. Sacrifice gained freedom from sin for the person who offered it up. And there was a substitution, animal for person. You sinned, but I'm not going to kill you, sacrifice an animal, and that blood will atone for the sin. Then the forgiven person was to follow God's way as stated in the law. By the way, the law meaning the 10 Commandments and also the whole story of creation and redemption as descendants of Abraham. And we can read all the details of this, stage 1 and stage 1.1, in the Old Testament. Now, you need to understand, because this was a difficult one for the people of Israel to understand, that the law was not about laws and legalisms, but about relationship of sinful humans with their holy Creator. God also gave Israel prophets to remind the people of God's purpose in the law, which was relationship with God. And those prophets spoke of a day when the perfection once enjoyed in Eden would be recreated, and all of suffering and sin in the present age would be erased. The law was to remind people of God's purpose and their purpose. Their purpose to be the prototype of restored relationship with God. Unfortunately, how come that word always creeps into this story? Unfortunately, human sin got in the way again. It seems to be embedded in human nature. Well, of course, that's the nature of the fall. Over time, the law got whittled down from an encompassing worldview and attitude and life focus on living with God. It got whittled down to a set of rules and regulations. Now, rules and regulations aren't all bad. Rules and regulations are what makes possible a civil society. What makes possible a household where children learn the boundaries as they're growing up. They can put a fence around human behavior and help control bad impulses and desires that come in from the outside. Boundaries make winning possible. We know this from sports. So rules and regulations are not all bad. Still, God is seeking our hearts. And we can follow a rule or a law without our heart being in it and without ever being reformed from the inside out. God's plan is to redeem us from sin and the effects of sin so that we can fully enjoy His company and He ours, as was it originally intended. Think about this, those of you who have raised children. When they're smaller, you have tighter rules and regulations, and as they grow older, you hope that they will reach a point where it's internalized, and they no longer just obey you, they agree with you, and you enjoy at some point an adult and mature and joyful relationship with your children. For some, it takes longer than others, and some of us are still growing as well. But that's what God was intending, not just a set of boundaries, but a full enjoyment of our company as was originally intended. When the law was boiled down to rules and regulations, morality became moralism, and righteousness became self-righteousness, because people focused on following the letter of the law rather than living out the purpose of the law. Among the leaders of Israel and the descendants of Abraham and Moses, there developed this attitude that said, I followed all the laws, so therefore I am a good person. I'm justified before God. It's an attitude that's still around today, inside and outside of churches. I meet a lot of people who say, well, I'm a good person. Often what they're not saying is, and maybe not thinking clearly about, is that I've taken on a set of what's good and what's bad from a number of sources that I can't really name for sure, but I kind of feel it. And I've measured myself, and I measure up to what is good, so therefore I'm good. You see, the descendants of Abraham at least had the law, the commandments. Today in the 21st century America, I'm not sure we have anything for a lot of people to base it on. But it's an attitude that isn't in relationship with the living God who makes us good. I would say, if you ask me, say, I'm bad. I'm basically bad. But thanks be to God through Jesus Christ, I can be made good. So God saw the need for another stage in his rescue plan. He came in person to teach and show us what he means. That's stage 2 of God's rescue plan, and that was Jesus. He was pure gold. Remember Robert Frost's poem? Nature's hardest hue to hold. Jesus was pure gold. The continuation of God's plan of redemption to restore us to golden. Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. He was the living Word, the Word made flesh. And yet humans mocked him. They rejected him. Still do today. And they killed him, and he was laid in a tomb to decay like all other perishable things. But then something unique and unexpected happened. The glory that had faded on the cross returned. Death could not keep him, and Jesus arose. This was God's vindication of his life, the purpose of his death, and a foretaste of what we too will experience: resurrection. The luster of gold shone forth in that glory, and he called his disciples once again to follow him. Jesus then set in motion stage 3 of God's rescue plan. He trained his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey all that he had commanded. And then he bestowed upon his disciples, that is the church, the Holy Spirit, like the continuing presence of Jesus himself, to equip us for our purpose in God's plan. And so we're somewhere in stage 3 now. I know you all woke up this morning and said, "Hey, I'm in stage 3 today," right? Well, guess what? Tomorrow you can wake up and say that. We're somewhere in stage 3 of God's great rescue plan. Surrendering ourselves to Christ as disciples of Christ, so that he can live through us, becoming the goodness of God in us, and so we can bring others to him. As it is written, "But now a righteousness from God, apart from law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify." This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. And then he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." When we share in Holy Communion, we are taking Jesus into ourselves. He is the righteousness of God. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty." Remember, after Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, he went out into the wilderness for 40 days, and there he was tempted by the devil. And one of the temptations of the devil was, Jesus has been fasting for a while, you would be hungry too, wouldn't you? The devil said, "You're the Son of God. Tell these stones to turn into loaves of bread. You can do it." And Jesus' response was, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus is the living Word. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. When we make him our daily bread, we find the strength to live for and with him. It's part of God's plan. Every time we share Holy Communion, we proclaim our faith in God's plan and purpose for us. Don't we always say, "Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, we proclaim our faith in God's plan and purpose for us. And the culmination of God's great plan is stage 4. That's the return of Jesus to earth, to bring us into a new creation, the new creation that the prophets of old spoke of, with all of God's goodness. This is promised in Jesus' own words and described in the last book of the Bible. What's that book again? Revelation, that's right. So it's revealed in this last book of the Bible, stage 4 of God's rescue plan, the return of Jesus. That great climax of history is still future, but it is what we are aiming for in our living. And if you're not aiming for something, you won't hit the target. We were made for glory. And in Him, we are headed back to glory and original goodness, just like God intends. God has a plan to restore all to original goodness through Jesus. We have a purpose, God's purpose, to live for Christ and to win people back from sin into His family. Only with Christ in us can we hope to live God's purpose for us. Say with me these words from Galatians. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself up for me. Amen.